You are listening to The Machine, a podcast from Waterford Institute of Technology. My name is Rob O'Connor and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Computing and Mathematics. I'm joined in studio today by Brenda Mullally and Eamonn de Leastar, and we're going to talk about web development. Before we get on to the topic, just to let you know that we're available on all the major podcasting platforms, and if you want to tweet us, we are at machine_podcast. If you do use any of the podcasting platforms and you'd like to leave us a review, that'd be lovely. 5 stars, please. We don't want any no-star reviews. That would just not be helpful at all. Right, Eamonn and Brenda, both of you teach web development in a variety of different forms here in the Institute. You've also worked on a whole load of web projects, as have I. So I thought this might be a nice topic to discuss, maybe the growth of the web over the last 20 odd years, some of the tools and technologies, and how somebody might get into it if they wanted to dabble. The first thing I want to do, though, is make a distinction. There's a lot of people think that the web and the internet are the same thing, and that the two terms are interchangeable. And I don't know, I don't mind either of you who wants to take this, but what's the difference between the web and the internet?
It's a good one. I suppose it pervades our lives so much we tend to find it hard to pull things apart these days. But if you think of the web, start with the browser. Browser is your gateway into the web experience. The internet itself is underlying the browser, and you can use the internet independent of any browser. If you're using Netflix, you're using the internet, using email, using the internet. So you think of the internet as the plumbing, if you like, whereas the web is one particular channel running along that plumbing.
Would you agree with that, Brenda?
I would, yeah. And at a basic level, I suppose the internet, you can think of it as all these computers, servers, devices, connected, networked. So it's all the kind of hardware side of things, the cables and that. And the web is one way that we access information on that internet. It's how we present information, whether we're an educational organisation like WIT or a business or a charity.
Yeah, I was thinking about it before we came in here, and we've been using a cooking analogy on the podcast over the last number of episodes, and I was thinking about how could we apply cooking analogy to the web and the internet, and I thought about it as, well, the internet is the cooker in the kitchen, maybe it's a frying pan or an oven, it's the things that you use, whereas the web is perhaps the dish that you're serving and the ingredients that you're using. Don't know if that really works, but I think there are two that complement each other and they can't exist without each other, but they are separate things.
Yeah, it's worth remembering that when it was invented, the web was invented after the internet. So
Yes.
the internet had been around for 15 or so years, 20 even, by the time Tim Berners-Lee had the idea of what to put on top of it. And there were other things running on it before he invented the web and its protocols.
So the internet has been around since the 70s, isn't that correct?
Originated in the mid to late 60s, but as we know it now, yes, since the 70s.
Whereas the web is a 1990s, mid-90s invention or development.
Early 90s.
Yeah, so we're talking about the Mosaic web browser. Is that was that the first one?
I think there was one before that as well. Might have been called Lynx, but
Lynx,
Mosaic,
that's right. It's a text-based one. Lynx, and then we have Netscape and Internet Explorer and the browser wars, which we're not going to get into. But what we've established now is that the web and the internet, we kind of think of them as the same thing, but they are different. And we're talking about the web as opposed to the internet. We might do a podcast on the internet and infrastructure and how network protocols work, but we're not talking about that today. Right. So probably the most prevalent example of the web is the web page that somebody interacts with. Web pages, you referred to them as documents in a previous podcast, Eamonn. So what goes into creating a web page?
Well, it's designed around, going back to its origins, around documents, around what would have been text you enter into a very simplest editor, like a notepad. But the formal definition of a web page now revolves around, it's a single thing. It's got a header and a body. The header defines something about the main overview of the page, and the body is its content. So it's not dramatically like a Word document, for instance, where you would have in the document headers, paragraphs, bullet points, and of course images and links. So if in your head you're used to using word processing tools to create a document, you're not a million miles away from creating a web page.
But behind the web page, we have the first acronym that we're going to introduce today, which is HTML. Brenda, would you like to describe to us what HTML is?
Pop quiz. HTML, Hypertext Markup Language. So quite a long-winded name, and we really only use HTML acronym as its common known name. We don't really use the long one. And HTML allows us to place structure on the contents of our document or web page. So it helps us to structure the paragraphs, the titles, the headings, the images. That's why it's called markup language, because we're describing, is this piece of content a paragraph? Is it a title? Is it a header? Is it a footer? So we're marking it up.
Yeah, so it's a series of tags. So it's almost like you have the development view and the public view. And the development view, you can see these tags like in the angle brackets and P or head or something like that. And then it might say, H1, close bracket, some title, close the bracket. And that will be presented as like a header text.
Yes. So you have two views. When you're doing web development, you're looking at the result in the browser, how you see the title, the little blurb about the web page, what the page is about, maybe who has written it and about that individual. And then when you're editing it, so when you're creating it, you're in some form of editor, whether it's something like Atom or Sublime, which is just a text editor. And we wrap all the content in these tags, these HTML tags. And so you're editing and adding content in there, putting in new tags, and then you view it in the browser. So that's what everybody sees when they use the browser on the web.
HTML is often used in conjunction with another TLA, 3-letter acronym, which is CSS. So you'll often see HTML/CSS.
That's right.
What's CSS?
Cascading style sheets, another big long-winded one. And again, we always just say CSS once you know it. In web development, we like to divide a web page into structure, style, and action. Structure is HTML, style is CSS, and we'll get on to action later, but it's potentially JavaScript. So CSS for the style, it's the colours, the background, the layout. So how the web page looks, not what it contains in it, but how it looks overall. And that makes a big impact.
And the point of separating out the two is so that when you're if you're doing a small website that's 1 or 2 pages, it doesn't really matter. But if you were doing a site that had a few pages, you wouldn't want to have to say, this is blue, this is black,
exactly,
this is this font every single time. So that's why you put it in a style sheet and you kind of say it once. And then if you decide you want to change from an Arial font to a Helvetica font, you change it in the style sheet and then it changes across the whole site.
Exactly. And that's kind of fundamental of development or programming principles, where you want to reuse and not write the same piece of code in lots and lots of different files. So you put it into one place and you share it. So
HTML, CSS, we've established what those are. We've established that the browser is something that we use to view websites that are written in those technologies with some sort of simple text editor. However, most medium or even small websites would be written using a CMS, which is a content management system. There's many examples of them out there. I think WordPress is the most widely used one. There's also Joomla, Drupal, Expression Engine. There's buckets of them. What is a content management system? And we'll give it to you as well, Brenda, because you're on a roll here.
I'm on a roll. Content management system is it's a whole setup, I suppose, or system that allows you to pick templates, to choose pre-existing layouts, to use pre-existing HTML code, and you can slot in your content. And so you don't have to be proficient in HTML and CSS and JavaScript potentially, that you can use this content management system to supply it your content, and it presents it. It generates the web page for you. So the labour, I suppose, is reduced. The need for programming skills are reduced. So it it allows a lot more people to have accessibility to developing their own website, if it's for a blog or a personal site. You don't have to go and do a programming course. It makes it accessible. So the content management system manages all of that development and in some ways the maintenance of it also.
But it's a double-edged sword, though, because there's a website that I look after for a local voluntary group, and I tried to get them to. It's a WordPress site because I thought that would be easy. Now these are non-technical people. I mean, they're not. They're just not technical people. They're very intelligent people. They're just not used to this kind of stuff. And WordPress blitzes them in that they look at WordPress and there's so many options and there's so many things available to them, and it's a bit scary.
Well, if you think now, content management systems are actually being used by web development companies.
Yes.
So you go as a business to get a website built, and often the web development company uses a particular content management system, partially, for their ease of development of a site, but also in their minds it allows you to be able to update a little bit as well, because you go through an interface and you can update your headlines, add news and so on. But yes, if you're non-technical, these systems, which are software, can be very difficult to navigate.
Yeah. But I suppose if it was easy, everyone would do it.
Sure.
Which is the other side of it. So let's just... So we're talking really about what are static sites, and we're going to move on to dynamic sites, which are action-based sites, in a few minutes. But maybe we might just reflect, and I think we all have enough miles on the clock to be able to look back a little bit in time, and we think about how web development has moved on since the 1990s. Now, I remember clearly, when I was in college, I started college in 1995, and we used to come into the library on a Saturday to use the web because it was there and there was a Netscape browser and you could see, stupid websites about football or Star Wars or some silly things like that. But they were very, very static. They kind of look, if you see them today, the way they looked back then, they just look awful. They look terrible. Kind of the GeoCities style, spinning GIFs and awful kind of text-based things. I mean, what way would you reflect on how websites look and feel here we are in 2018 compared to even 1998? Eamonn?
Yeah, I guess the look and feel is very dramatic, really. It's gone from fairly block structured, very much influenced by word processing layouts and grids in the 90s and early noughties, to something that's much more fluid now. It's much more variable. So every page can look dramatically different from other pages. And the flow of a page, its navigation is dramatically different from what it used to be. In the old days, it was maybe simple bullet points or maybe a menu along the top. Now it could be anything, really. And the anything is designed to take no learning. You just interactively and dynamically adjust to the flow of the page, and you can pick it up intuitively. So the experience is quite different. It's an advancement in human-computer interaction, really, and the overall user experience field has been significant.
It's interesting about that. You talk about something being intuitive. I was talking to a project student last week at a meeting, and we were talking, like, in the olden days, you would have a software manual. I mean, that type of thing doesn't exist anymore.
Yes.
And a lot of that, I think, largely comes from the web, in that people have become used to using computers and computing technology through websites.
Yes, and I suppose one aspect from the 90s and noughties is the sites you visited were showing the same content no matter who you were. Of course, now it's quite different. The sites you visit know who you are, know a lot about you, and you're being delivered quite customized content, which is a little bit alarming occasionally, and you mightn't realize it often, but it's a big shift the last few years.
Hold that thought, because we're going to come back to that in a moment. There's another term that I want to bring in, because I was trying to explain it to somebody recently, and I thought it's a good one. We talk about responsiveness. Now, immediately, if you say responsiveness to somebody, about what's a responsive website, they might think, oh, does it mean it loads fast? That's not what it means. Brenda, you're nodding your head. Could you explain to us what is a responsive website?
Responsiveness in this context means it responds to the device that you're using to view the website. So whether you're on a phone, a smartphone, whatever size it comes in, a tablet, a widescreen laptop, PC, desktop. So it responds to the viewing area, I guess, and the website will look different depending on what device you're on. And it will adapt so that rather than having to scroll left or right, which is hideous, it will stack things.
Yes.
Menus might disappear. Images might even reduce in some cases, particularly for mobile viewing. And that's what responsiveness is about. It's not about time for the pages to load.
And this comes back to what you were saying, Eamonn, about more kind of fluid structures in a website, that using either a content management system or an underlying framework in your development, the HTML and CSS and other systems can work together to deliver a slightly different experience. Same content, but presented in a different way, whether you're looking at it on your phone, desktop, etc., etc.
Absolutely, yeah. The other aspect I was just thinking there when Eamonn was talking about 20 years ago, I find it now that the content on websites are changing all the time. So 20 years ago when you went to a website, a month later you go to it and it pretty much had the same content. Whereas now each day when you go to a website, we almost expect the content to be different. And there's huge pressure, I guess, on institutions, organisations, businesses to manage their content so that it's always up to date. We now live in an environment where we expect everything to be available to us at the go to the website and you'll find out the information there at the moment that you need it. So you have to maintain that content, and I suppose content management systems try to support that so that it's easy to add new news, put up whatever's happening on the calendar, new blog posts and so on. That aspect of the web has changed a lot. The timeliness of the content on sites.
Now, Eamonn, I hope you've held that thought in your head.
Trying to remember it.
Right. So we're going to go. So we've established now that websites using a whole variety of different technologies can be built relatively easy in that it's easy if you know how to reflect different devices or behave differently on different devices. But that's the first instance of the website knowing a little bit about you as the user and tailoring an experience to you. However, it goes much deeper than that, doesn't it?
Yeah, and we try to use different terms for them, maybe even a website or a web app, for instance.
Yes.
And that's a handy way of sort of pulling it apart. So a website that you might use regularly, say Wikipedia is a good example. It doesn't really know who you are. It presents the content the same to everybody. And
it can be responsive though, but it's not.
Yes.
Yeah.
It may be responsive in that it may be tuned to the device, but not to you.
Yes.
Go to Amazon or Facebook, you're looking at a different thing completely. You're logging in for one thing, and once you've logged in, then you've entered a different world. So the application now, not the site, we'll call it, in there is building pages for you dynamically based on your interests, experience, and also on your navigation around the site. That probably goes beyond now content management systems, which is what might be behind Wikipedia, into a full web application platform and the whole infrastructure around that these companies have had to put in place.
And that involves programming.
Yes.
Now, in the web, programming is often done through what's called scripting. It's not always done it can be done through, your traditional computing programming languages as well, but it's often done through scripting. What is scripting, Eamonn?
So scripting is just programming. So
right, okay.
It's nothing. It's not really anything less than or more than programming, but it's a term that's useful because we talk about scripting clients or client-side scripting and web server-side scripting.
Okay,
or programming.
Maybe that's something that we haven't talked about. What is the server? So we talked about the browser. The browser is actually what we call a client. But what's the server in this relationship?
Yeah, so the web as designed is a client-server system. Client is the computer on which the browser is running. So we say the browser is the client. And when you enter in a web address, you're interacting with a server somewhere else in the cloud, on the internet. That's the server. So code is triggered on the server to retrieve the pages which are presented in the client. So a little dance going on there all the time. Every time you press a link or change the address bar on the browser, you're creating a request to the server, and the server is giving you back a page. That's all it is, really. It's nothing more complicated than that.
Unless you've got programming on the server.
Well, then is the page just a page sitting there in a folder somewhere? Or, as we were discussing, is there no pages there, but everything created dynamically by a program to build the page for you? That's where server-side programming or scripting comes in. And then client-side scripting would be where you've got the page back, but you'd like to make it a little bit more interactive, or you might for an animation, or maybe to show a gallery or show some sort of activity on the screen, even if you're not interacting directly with it. That would be called scripting on the client side then. So this is typically done in JavaScript, and it would be a little program that would do something interesting inside the browser for visual effect or other purposes.
So when we talk about client-side scripting, often JavaScript, that's not the only one, but mostly JavaScript is eating the world at the moment. So a little program, when you download your HTML and CSS, there's another little part of it, of that code, is written in a thing called JavaScript. And that might make a menu appear or disappear based on certain things, or might move something around, or, you know, it can do nice little bits on the page, but the processing is done on your browser, not on the server that's off up in the cloud.
So you're getting one or a series of messages into the browser from the server, and then a program is running in the browser to build the page effectively. And some modern sites, there's almost no HTML. It's entirely JavaScript coming down, and it's reassembled then by the browser, often working quite hard to build the page and make it interactive.
But that's also tied up with the concept that the phones in our pocket are incredibly powerful, and they can do an awful lot of number crunching whenever we need them to.
Yes, and often it may be more efficient to be sending down slightly more streamlined data that is built up on the browser than using less network space and making the phone or the device work a little bit harder to deliver the experience.
So server-side scripting, though, that's done on the web server, on the cloud, and that's arguably much more powerful.
It is, I think we would just call it programming, really. Programming web applications.
Yeah.
Sometimes we use the word script to refer to a category of language, but that's kind of blurring now, really.
So I mean, there was a historic divide between programming languages that are compiled, which we talked about in earlier podcasts. So you write some code, you run it through a compiler, and that generates a binary that can then be run. Whereas scripts tended to be what was called interpreted. Is that correct? So they just run.
Yes, and they were often designed around stringing things together. Picking a file from here, merging a bit of file from there, building up something, injecting maybe a few small changes, rather than the kind of heavyweight programs that people maybe have heard us talk about in the past. So those scripts were intended to be easier to develop, more accessible, and perhaps not as challenging to get your head around on the first go. But they've matured a lot since then.
Yeah.
So they are now as functional and as complete as the older style languages.
So can you give me an example of some names of scripting languages that somebody might use?
Well, JavaScript we mentioned already.
Yeah.
JavaScript runs inside the browser, also runs in the server. It's not your dad's JavaScript anymore. It's a big, powerful language and reasonably well respected. PHP is another language people may have heard of, kind of classic scripting language from the early days as well. Runs on the server only, largely. And people may have heard then of more modern scripting languages like Python, which again can run on the client or the server. They have much wider usages now than just web. Brenda would tell us for hours about Python and data and what you can do with it, but it's a slightly different world.
What's interesting there is that these like HTML, CSS is clearly a web technology. It was built for the web and for websites. Yeah. Whereas these other technologies, JavaScript largely built for the web, but has gone the other way, has invaded the traditional computing programming space. Whereas Python is neither. It's just there, and it can be used in either context or any context that you might like it to be.
Yeah, JavaScript escaped from the browser. And it's the most widely deployed language in history because it's in every browser.
Yes.
And because it's so widely deployed, and particularly in the last 10 years, it's been modernized. It's just hugely accessible.
I,
Python, on the other hand, though, is probably a bit more solid foundation to it, and has a slightly more interesting applications in certain areas.
what do you think about that, Brenda?
Yeah, I mean, certainly within the data area, Python is now heavily used. But it has both contexts. It can be in the web area, and it's a full programming language. So,
Yeah.
Its capabilities are vast.
Yeah, and there's a lot of resources and libraries available
Yes.
for Python and JavaScript and other languages as well. Other languages are available.
Yeah,
We're
it's
not-
well developed. It's established. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting when you talk about JavaScript, and it's not your dad's JavaScript, because I remember I worked as a web developer a number of years ago, and JavaScript used to be the bane of my life, mostly because there were different implementations of JavaScript depending on what browser you had. Now, this is back in the early 2000s, and you had the Microsoft JavaScript, and then you had the kind of the everybody else JavaScript, and it wasn't a one-for-one mapping. So, you could write some code that would run lovely in Internet Explorer, but then you went to another browser and it was a dog's dinner.
Yeah, it's a fascinating history, really. I mean, the apocryphal stories that it was written in 2 weeks in the 90s.
As you do.
But in the early years, it had a poor enough reputation because the language itself was fairly crude initially. But over time, two things were realised, really. I think one, it was realised that the language was a bit better than people thought, largely because the creator was quite smart, really. And he embodied principles from older languages into it that people only uncovered over time. And then secondly, the big change happened when companies like Google arrived and redeveloped very high performance JavaScript engines and then focused on modernising the language. So now we have something quite different, really, from what it was then.
Yeah. Now, let's imagine I've been listening to this and I wanted to get into some web development. Say I've never developed anything in the web before, but I've used Word or I've used systems like that, and I wanted to get into a bit of web development, maybe try it out. If you could give me one skill or tool or one recommendation, what would it be, each of you? So maybe Brenda.
I suppose you have a couple of different starting points. You could go to, there are lots of sites now where you can go and develop your own personal website. And there's entry level free. You mightn't have a web address, which is brendamallally.com, but you would have a site that would be visible by anybody you wanted to give the address to. And in a very simple way, you'd be able to put in your content. Now, you probably wouldn't have much access to the languages in behind CSS and HTML. So that's a very first basic entry point. The other would be, and it would be my preference, to delve into HTML and CSS a little bit. There are, mini tutorials and so on that you could do on the web. And within a few hours, you could start to create your own HTML pages that you could then even just view locally in your own browser and start off there.
So the sites that you're recommending, the kind of builders, that's things like Wix.com,
yes,
WordPress.com, those kind of ones.
Simplesite.com, yes, those kinds of ones.
Simple things. Whereas if you're to do it yourself, it's just you can download it locally, run it on your machine, and off you go. Sure.
And if you wanted then to put it up on the web so it's accessible for anybody to see, then you have to go the next step and get it hosted in some way.
Yes.
And that's another journey, and it's not difficult, but there are sites where you can go and either pay or get free hosting.
Yes.
And basically it's a process of moving your web page files to the service, wherever their server is.
So the kind of the Wix model, it's great, and it can be, if you need something quick and dirty, it's fantastic. Yeah. And perhaps if you were looking to develop a site for your local football club or something like that,
exactly,
you could get it done in Wix very, very quickly, and it will be there. But if you wanted, but you're tied into a particular format.
Yes, it could look the same as 20 other club sites.
Yes.
Because with those kinds of content management systems, the styles, the templates and so on, they're pretty generic and you're limited in choice, but they're perfectly fine for a starting point. But if you want to go the next little step and put your own stamp on it and be able to have more flexibility in how it looks and so on, then really you want to get into writing the code and getting it hosted yourself.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
Eamonn?
Yeah, so I think if you might want to distinguish between whether you want to amaze and amuse your friends or whether you want to dig into technology. You'll amaze and amuse your friends by going to WordPress, I think, or Squarespace is a great
Yes,
one.
yeah.
These are amazing sites, really, and they're fantastic for probably the majority of users who want to get into the web. But if you want to get into the programming side, then you will want to learn the basics of HTML. It's an absolutely fundamental building block. I recommend this in the past, Free Code Camp.
Yes.
Just a place to go, really.
Yeah.
You won't be building sites that will stun anybody, but you'll be straight into examining and getting lessons on the core foundations of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in a nice, reasonably paced manner. Still be done inside the browser, but it won't be hiding anything from you. And it won't be giving you any shortcuts.
Yeah. I'm going to make a recommendation that is technology neutral. I would recommend somebody learn a little bit about user experience. Mm-hmm. It's something I have kind of an interest area in. I don't know an awful lot about it, but it's, I suppose maybe we could describe it as, it's hard to describe what a good website is, but it's very easy to describe what a bad one is. Mm-hmm. And it's maybe trying to make those distinctions. So, I mean, even read a Wikipedia page on user experience. And what we might do is after this, I might tweet out some links of kind of further reading based on the podcast that we're discussing. Would either of you care to make a prediction about the future, about where web is going? Seeing as we've gone from a kind of a static document type model to very, very heavy and quite intelligent systems that are now looking at us on the web in a 20-year period.
Yeah, I'll mention one thing that's coming along. Now, the web is advancing on so many fronts. You could pick anything, really, and say it's a winner, and it could be gone in 6 months. But Brenda was talking about responsive there earlier on, which is the notion that your web page experience is tuned to the device you're on. There's another word called progressive, which is coming out the last 2 years or so. Progressive web apps we talk about. It's kind of related to responsive in that it's trying to keep adjusted the experience to the device you're on, but also to how you're using the device and also the capabilities of the device. So progressive web apps, you're looking at apps that know a little bit more than just what a web page can do. They're getting closer to what an app can do. So we've seen the growth of apps on phones, iOS and Android apps, and you can see the experience there can be a little bit different from the web, a bit more personalized, a bit slicker, a bit more integrated. There's been an effort in recent years to make the web match that experience, and the current term for that is PWA, Progressive Web App. So when you visit it, it tries to adjust to the device you arrived on, and then it tries to also learn from your interactions. And next time you visit, give you a slightly different experience as you've acquired the affordances and so on that the site offers. And then also, via modern web standards, know where you are, possibly. Have access to the camera if you make those permissions available. And do other app-like things that current standard web apps don't really do yet.
So PWA, TBC,
yes,
to be continued. And that might be something that we refer to back to. I mean, we've discussed JavaScript, but we haven't got into any of the environments now that are based on JavaScript. Probably the most widely known one is a thing called Node.js. But we leave that off for future podcasts because we can dig a lot deeper there. Right, well, Brenda and Eamonn, thank you very much for having a chat to us today about web development, and don't forget we are available on all the major podcasting platforms at @machine_podcast on Twitter, and probably get a website up eventually when I have a few minutes to actually put one together. I think I might build it. You're going to do it for me?
No, I could recommend a content management system for you to use.
Oh, yeah. Is the content management system called Brenda Mullally Web Development? Right, lads, thanks very much.
Okay.
Thanks,
Rob.